Welcome to episode 10 of Athena Rising, where we pose 36 questions to powerhouse female lawyers. Why 36? That's the number of states that were required to ratify the 19th Amendment and give women the right to vote and take power into our own hands.
Our guest today is Soumya Dayananda, a white-collar and investigations partner at Wilkie Farr in D.C. Soumya was a Special Investigative Counsel for the U.S. House Committee's review on the January 6 attacks on the Capitol. On this episode, Soumya talks about serving in that capacity, transitioning from the government to private practice, and tells us a little bit about her personal life.
We're glad you're tuning into our podcast, whether you're an Athena or an ally. Welcome. Ladies, let's rise.
Hi, Marisol. How are you?
Excited today.
I know.
My name is Marisol Descalzo, and I am a white-collar criminal defense lawyer practicing in Miami, and I have cases all over the country. Vanessa Johannes is a partner at Carlton Fields, also practicing in the white-collar space. Vanessa, you want to tell us who we have on today?
Welcome, everybody, to another episode of Athena Rising. Today, we are very, very lucky to have Soumya Dayananda. Did I say your name correctly, Soumya?
You did. Thank you.
Awesome. Yay. Score for the win. Now, Soumya is a partner at Wilkie Farr. She joined recently in 2023. Prior to that, she served as Senior Investigative Counsel for the U.S. House of Representatives Select Committee to investigate the attack on the U.S. Capitol, which occurred on January 6th. She also previously served as a Senior Investigative Counsel at the U.S. Senate Homeland Security and Government Affairs Committee. It is the Senate's top oversight committee. She led high-profile bipartisan investigations in that capacity. Prior to that, her government service runs very, very long. She was an AUSA in ED&Y for more than a decade. And then she started her career, I believe, as an ADA in the Manhattan District Attorney's Office. So she's been a prosecutor for a very long time, an investigative counsel for a very long time, and now she's in the private sector. We'll talk to her today about all those various roles and hats. On a personal note, she is a mother of two young girls, ages 4 and 6. So we can empathize with you. We're in the same sort of camp as having very young children. And she still somehow manages to do it all, like all of our Athenas who appear before us. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much. So nice to meet both of you. It's an honor to be invited to be on this podcast.
We're excited to have you.
Well, let's go ahead and get started. As you know, we do 36 questions, rapid fire, and they're not 36 questions that you know about, so our audience is clear and aware, but they're designed to get to know your practice a little bit better and to get to know you better as a woman and as a female lawyer that's a badass in this collective space. So here we go. First of all, you are, just so everybody knows, you're the first person we've ever interviewed that neither of us have ever met in person.
Right.
So as much as we're going to get to know you today, so is our audience, and that's going to be a very unique experience. Let's talk a little bit about your background. It is highly commendable. You've held roles and titles and done work that people only aspire and dream of doing. Let's talk a little bit about your most recent role prior to joining private practice, serving as Special Investigative Counsel for the Select Committee for January 6th. How did you get that role? How did that come to be? Can you tell us a little bit about it?
Sure. So I had been in New York for almost 20 years as a prosecutor, as you mentioned, as a DA, and then at ED&Y as a federal prosecutor. And then because of my husband's work, we moved to DC. So this was now the height of the pandemic in 2020. And it came to that point in my career where I just wanted to do something totally different. So I decided to work on Capitol Hill. And I was fortunate enough to have a great opportunity to work on the Senate side for Homeland Security, Government Affairs, which was almost like fulfilling like a college like dream to work on Capitol Hill. And I had just taken like this 20-year deviation before actually pursuing it and doing it. So the Senate was an awesome experience. It's very different from being a prosecutor in very different ways, but investigations were investigations. So it was very much fact-finding and drafting a report. So after the Senate experience, I got to the point again where I was ready to make a pivot in my career, was looking at going to private practice at that point. And then this unique and really incredible opportunity came to serve on the investigative committee for the House. So I thought, given that this is like kind of the crux of what it means to be in DC and continuing my work on Capitol Hill, I took it. So it was really an amazing experience, an intense experience. But the level of lawyering and the subject matter and just the kind of the goodwill we had from doing this work was really awesome.
I want to just dial it back. What was, for those listeners that don't know, what was the purpose of this investigative committee that you were a part of?
Sure. So the January 6th committee was designed by a House resolution to investigate the leading up to and the events of January 6th. So the committee itself was organized in a manner where there was a chief investigative counsel and 5 senior leads to pursue particular subject matters. I was the senior lead to investigate the law enforcement and military response on January 6th. So that included law enforcement, the intelligence leading up to the day of, and the response by the Metropolitan Police Department, the FBI, DHS, as well as the military aspect with the National Guard's response. So for many people who were home on January 6th and watching these events unfold, particularly, I think former prosecutors were wondering where their police presence was, what took the National Guard so long. So these were some of the questions that we looked into with my team.
What did you apply for that role, or did that specific position, or to be part of that investigative team, or you got selected?
So the Chief Investigative Counsel reached out to me. I think there was a desire to hire folks who were former prosecutors who essentially were able to work under tight timelines, have a huge amount of information, review documents, get to schedule depositions in a very fast manner, which is something, a skill set of prosecutors typically have. Other investigative attorneys obviously have that as well. So, in a lot of worlds, I'm sure Miami is the same, the legal community is very small. So my name was provided to him and he reached out. So
that's amazing.
Yes, it was.
No, go ahead.
It was a great experience with the level of attorneys who were incredibly talented and all working on the same mission. Was really a rewarding experience.
So I was going to ask, how was the team built? I mean, you were leading the charge, leading the team, but how was the team built, and how did you on day one, take that baton and run with it?
Yes, it's a great question. So I had a little bit of a head start because of the Senate side. I drafted and investigated the report. There was a bipartisan report with my Republican counterparts on Senator Portman's side. So it was Senator Gary Peters from Michigan and Robert Portman. We had a report issued in June. So that was just 2 to 3 months after the attack on the Capitol. And it was solely focused on the security preparations. So it did not get into the broader picture of the Stop the Steal efforts, the role of President Trump, of course, and some of the other larger domestic violence extremisms issues that were at play. So the committee, as it was designed for the House committee, since each team had a particular subject matter portfolio, essentially, like from day one, it's conducting any investigation, it's knowing what documents you wanted to have. So a number of letters went out to federal agencies that were involved in the preparations. It's receiving those documents, reviewing those documents, and then just creating your witness list, of who is going to have the relevant information on these topics. So my team was, again, it was about 4 attorneys, really talented group of folks who came from different aspects of the government. And we were able to kind of divide it to some people dealing with the National Guard issues, some people dealing with the intelligence issues, and some people just dealing with just the actual security preparations. Then other teams, it was a really unique atmosphere because everybody's working on different parts of what led to January 6th. So part of that was the people who were on the rioters. So there was a whole team investigating the rioters. There was a whole team investigating the issues of the Stop the Steal efforts, and President Trump's awareness that the election was in fact not stolen. There was a team working on the role of domestic violence extremism groups, and then there was a team that was just dedicated to investigating the finances aspect and who was funding the rally and kind of other fundraising aspects of exploiting the message of Stop the Steal to gain money. So we would have the organization was critical because of the time, the urgent timeline we were on. So we would essentially have these Monday meetings where everybody would come in a room, the 5 team leads, our chief investigative counsel, and kind of go through what we had done that week and what was coming up that week. And the pace of it was pretty incredible.
Soumya, did the team leads frequently interact, share information? Was it, in addition to running your team, I can imagine that you're also making sure that you're not overlapping work with other teams and that everyone is on the same page. That's a lot of organization. Tell us how that worked in real time.
Yeah, it's a great question. So we were all in kind of this huge room with like cubicles. So you would hear, the Monday morning meeting was critical, so you could hear what other depositions were being lined up by the other team leads. So inevitably, if there was an overlap, Vanessa, like you mentioned, then it would be, 2 people from 2 separate teams in the same interview. So, with any kind of investigation, just partnering with subject matter experts is critical. So that's really how a lot of the depots were handled. If there was this overlap, if there was like, that witness, for example, like Jared Kushner might have information about the finances, but also has information about, kind of intimate conversations that were happening about the election irregularities. So two people who had those particular topics would then lead that particular deposition. So it was a lot of pairing. We tried very hard to not get siloed. There was, because the pace was really so rapid, I think we did our best to really partner up with people who knew the information.
Was everyone working out of a secure building, or were you just?
It was, I can't say it was a secure building. It was kind of off the typical Capitol Hill campus. But when the pace of it really increased, there was a press pool camera in the building, and you couldn't conduct a deposition without it being reported on CNN like an hour later. So there was a constant level of scrutiny for wherever we were. People definitely knew the building we were in.
That's very different from, being a prosecutor and, being an ADA. Look, as a former prosecutor, you go to great lengths to protect your personal life, your personal identity, your family, your children, all that good stuff. I never wanted to be on TV with my cases necessarily. The office could issue the press release, but I didn't want to be on TV. How did you handle that pressure and that intense scrutiny with work that's already intense, the outside public pressure? How did you deal with that?
Yeah, it was such a bubble that was created in terms of the people that we were with in this room. And then when you couldn't get away from it because it was on the news all the time. When the hearings happened last summer, it was constant. Yeah. So the question of how I dealt with it, I don't think I dealt with it very well in the sense that you couldn't balance anything. All of us who were doing the work were singularly focused on the work, and it was taking up a lot of time without a lot of time left for self-care for your family. So there was, it was a period that, thankfully we all knew it was finite. It wasn't forever. But it's like when you're on a long trial, like you're keeping up this pace and there's going to be an end. Looking back, I think that there was a lot I could have probably done differently in terms of balancing my family in those moments. But there was an extreme pressure involved to get it right. And we all took it very seriously.
So how did you manage? You must have been working long hours, 7 days a week. How did you do it? What did you do with your kids? They were young at that time.
I had a wonderful, I'll start with my husband, who also has a very intense job. And he got it. I mean, there was like a joke like, oh, you're saving democracy. And like every, we tried to like not take it too seriously, but there was a lot of moments of juggling and balancing. I had a really lovely nanny for my children who would pick them up from 3 to 7. But yeah, I think we just got by. I think I've now looking back, particularly coming up on the 1 year since the hearings. We just got by. You just didn't from day to day. There were definitely moments. I remember last Father's Day where I screwed up because of the scheduling and you couldn't control anything. And I did. Did my husband have a good Father's Day last year? Probably not great, but like I'll make it up to him this year. So I think there's now looking back, being cognizant of certain things that I wasn't able to be aware of in the moment. And this applied to everybody who was involved. I mean, many folks were juggling families, and even if you're not juggling families, you're just juggling this intense pressure against taking care of yourself, which I think a lot of us weren't necessarily able to do.
Right. I mean, were you ever, look, because it's a bipartisan committee, we get it, everyone's working together, singing Kumbaya, but I mean, you can't talk about January 6th without understanding that politically there's a divide, and there's a divide somewhat in this country. Were you ever fearful for your safety, your personal safety, working on this committee?
So, I had tried really difficult cases in ED&Y that had, RICO cases with a number of murders involved, and you have the defendant's family in the courtroom, and you have the victim's family in the courtroom, and that to me was much more. It impacted me more in terms of kind of not a safety issue, but it was so much more real. When you put a victim in it on the stand, or you put like the Emmy on the stand, and they're showing photographs of the autopsy or the crime scene detective, and you hear the emotion from within the courtroom. So that's something that I coming into this felt more real in terms of the impact on my life. This was I don't personally, I didn't feel any like fear of for myself or for my family, but again, it was the scrutiny that was involved and the pressure of trying to get it right, because you couldn't get away from it. If you turned on the news, depending upon what news you were watching, it was on every single day. So that's a different kind of fear, in the sense of that pressure you put on yourself to make sure you're doing it the right way.
And for those in our audience that don't know, what did the committee's investigation lead to? Were people prosecuted? Was there a report created? What happened?
Right. So we had a series of hearings last summer where there were about 9 hearings that focused on the former president's multi-pronged efforts to undermine democracy, really. So that was one aspect of it. The other aspect was the report that was issued in December. And then as part of the report, there were criminal referrals for a number of folks, including, of course, President Trump. So that was the intent was not to issue these criminal referrals, but of course the facts led to particular charges, at least in the view of the committee. And we'll see what DOJ does, that there was, proof that he should be charged with these crimes. So the report, I think, was the big bulk of it, as well as the public hearings.
So in terms of working in a bipartisan committee, can you just tell us about the dynamics in, having to work, across the lines in a bipartisan sort of, functionality, if you will, given that the backdrop dealt with the former president?
Sure. So I think that to answer that question would really go back to my Senate side. So working with Senator Portman's staff to create the first bipartisan report, where you're really working with members and staff from across the aisle. Certainly the bipartisan members of on the committee of Representative Kinzinger and Ms. Cheney, the staff, I think we were able to work with the same mission. So on a typical kind of bipartisan investigation, there might not be that same view of the facts and the mission, but for For the House committee, it was certainly very different, that everybody knew what subject matter portfolio that they were pursuing. So there wasn't a lot of back and forth as far as what the facts were, what the next steps were in the investigation. The bipartisan aspect gave it the credibility that we needed. I think if we didn't have those Republican members, it would have been criticized for just being a Democratic pursuit. And because of the critical roles of Ms. Cheney and Representative Kinzinger, we had this, it was certainly shown as the bipartisan effort that it was.
When you called people to come and be deposed, could they assert the Fifth Amendment? And what does it mean to assert the Fifth Amendment in those proceedings? Could they be compelled?
Sure. So we did have a number of folks who did that, and there were cases that were litigated because of the assertion. There was many executive privilege assertions, and that some were, some were more difficult to actually be credible, as an executive privilege assertion. So I think for the portfolio that I dealt with, there weren't as many of those thorny issues as the folks who were pursuing the issues with the election interference, and people who were more in the former president's inner circle. So I will say, for the law enforcement and military people that we interviewed, they were tremendously cooperative and really wanted to help the committee, as a number of different witnesses did, and were understood the goal of the committee, which is incredibly different from a criminal investigation.
I know you can't delve into certain specifics that are outside of the report or what's publicly available with regard to the work that you did, but in terms of the law enforcement and military response, you said early on, all prosecutors watching this on January 6th were shocked and wondering, where's the National Guard? Where's the military? What is happening here? And that is true. I remember sitting in my office thinking, how is this happening on our Capitol? Where is, where is law and order? Can you tell us what the findings were, and in terms of the lack of military response, in terms of immediacy, and what led to that lack of immediacy, if you will?
So I think that it goes back to the summer after the murder of George Floyd. There was a lot of over-aggressive tactics that were used by law enforcement, and the National Guard was used in a way that was responding to civil disturbance protests that was criticized, as it should be criticized, in terms of the heavy-handedness in a response to protests that were found to be overly peaceful in hindsight, but in the moment, the response was very heavy-handed. So it was almost, one explanation was that it was almost like an overcorrection for people to be a little bit cautious about what happened during those summer events. There was many different issues involved, but I think a lot of it, if you just look at the law enforcement aspect, there certainly should be more of a pursuit of why the intelligence that they were able to see these warnings in plain sight of people saying they wanted to storm the Capitol, for example, why that wasn't taken seriously. Was there an aspect of race that was involved there for law enforcement to not take it seriously? Were people not putting together the dots of, thousands of people posting on Parler and Facebook, wherever, that this was their goal for January 6th, is to come to the Capitol? So there's the intelligence aspect, right? And then there's the preparation aspect. I think for the law enforcement folks, they thought that they were adequately prepared. They certainly did not anticipate the crowd to turn on law enforcement. And then with the National Guard, it is a complicated answer because the National Guard in DC is not controlled by the mayor. It's not a state. So you have to go through the chain of command of the Department of Defense. And they were not called on by the Capitol Police prior to January 6th, despite these warnings that the Capitol, may be attacked. And they were called on by Mayor Bowser in preparation. But the National Guard cannot go to the Capitol because of the various complicated DC jurisdiction issues unless the Capitol Police ask them to come, which didn't happen until probably the afternoon of the 6th. So it's a complicated answer.
Yeah.
But the remedy is that there people the law enforcement has to look back and kind of do an assessment of why they weren't taking these warnings seriously from certain groups. And that would be step one.
So I want to ask you about a particular point in your answer. Did race play a part? That that there's intelligence showing that they were screaming, if you will, on top of their lungs on these internet websites that they're going to come there and they're going to fight for their president, and they believe the election was flawed. And that you also mentioned they didn't anticipate the crowd to turn. People have said, and that it's not without merit, that there are people in law enforcement who were part of some of these groups that favored their agenda, if you will, in many ways, that felt that these groups were pro-law enforcement and were aligned with their interests. To the extent that race played a role in that, and not, what extent, I guess my question to you is, what extent do you think race did play a role in that, right? I mean, did race play a role in why law enforcement didn't think the crowd would turn?
So I think did race play a role? I think that, look, if this had been brown or black people posting similar posts that were filled with, at times rhetoric, but certainly conveying some sort of intent to come to the Capitol on the 6th, I think it would have been taken more seriously. Because there is the law enforcement perspective of First Amendment protected speech. There was this, and I don't want to say knee-jerk reaction, but the initial reaction was this is First Amendment protected speech, and they're allowed to, have their grievances about the election. But when you look at some of those warnings, and they have been posted. I mean, there's certainly some mentioned in the report. There's some mentioned in various Washington Post articles, as well as, some articles that have come out later. It's hard to not take it seriously. Of course, it's hindsight 2020, but if that had been similar Black Lives Matter groups, it would have been perceived differently.
I don't think they would have been able to get in the Capitol, right? And so that's how the public perceives it, at least.
Sure, and I think that you see how different preparations could have been taken, right? So, for example, the Capitol Police put up bike racks. Bike racks aren't necessarily going to stop a violent crowd, whereas they could put up a huge fence. Like, had they put up a fence, it would have been obviously a different day on the Capitol. So the warning, the intelligence that they saw wasn't necessarily operationalized. And I'll say that the MPD viewed it very differently. They had seen these rallies that occurred in October and November, where it was a pro-Trump rally where there were acts of violence. And I think the MPD saw that and had a different expectation of what could happen on the 6th because of that informed experience. And they did see the uptick on social media sites, particularly after President Trump put out a December 19th tweet of saying, he will be at this rally. So because of these different data points, they were, 100% all hands on deck on January 6th. The mayor did request the National Guard, but the Capitol Police took different steps and not as aggressive.
Is there a different view out there that, and just to play devil's advocate, that law enforcement did do the right thing, they were taking all the right steps, and it was, just a matter of being outmanned? I mean, is there a strong view out there that says that, or is your report definitive that there was problems?
So I let me say all of this to say that, the men and women in law enforcement who were there that day, I think that in many ways they were overwhelmed. They could not have expected this crowd to have gone the way it did. Many of them who we spoke to thought had no anticipation or had no intel about what could have been happening on January 6th. So they're brave, they're incredibly resilient, and withstood incredible amount of hours of just hand-to-hand combat that day. So I think to your answer, there are, I can't say whether the report was definitive about this. Everything I'm saying is just based upon what my, the experience of reviewing documents and interviewing these folks were. But certainly, folks say that this was First Amendment protected speech, and they could not have seen this coming. And I think a lot of that has to do with not connecting the dots prior to. And a lot of that has to do with the intelligence showing it, but no one looking at it from a holistic view and looking at it in aggregate to paint the story of what could have happened.
I know they couldn't connect the dots or did not, connect the dots ahead of time necessarily. But, we have seen a tremendous violence against brown and Black communities when they are in aggregate protesting various issues in this country by law enforcement, even when those protests are frankly quite peaceful. And so it was the question asked as to why more violence by law enforcement didn't occur to stop them from breaching the Capitol in the manner that they did. I can't imagine if this was brown or Black people that, law enforcement would not have, escalated their level of violence to quell the crowd. And it seemed here, at least what we saw on TV, that they did not do that, or perhaps they didn't do that in an organized fashion given the number of people. But the picture is very different than what we see on the ground when it is people, frankly, that look like, you and me. So
right.
I have to ask that because it was bizarre to watch that on TV, knowing what else is happening in our country at the time.
Right, but I think you hit the nail on the head there with the amount of people. So I think at some point, any good law enforcement, training, at some point, what if you up the violence back to the crowd, it can only exasperate the situation. Now, it would, if the crowd was brown or Black, would they have done that anyway? I don't know. Right. But when you look at the number of people that were there, and if you place yourself in the position of any Capitol Police officer who was trying to keep these crowds at bay, I think that logically it would have made the situation worse. So at that point, it's not a matter of in the moment what could have been done. Again, it's the preparations beforehand.
They weren't properly organized. Got it.
I have to ask this, and I'm sorry, but I represented, because I'm a criminal defense lawyer, a couple of the people, that were involved on January 6th, and I've heard from several this conspiracy theory that, if you watch the videos, law enforcement was opening the doors and letting, people in. And yeah. They truly believe this. And I just want to know, is that true? Was that crowd control?
It's one of those kind of Tucker Carlson theories that was put out there. And again, I just think people should just use their common sense. If you're one of these, officers who look out on a crowd and can't see the end of the crowd, and you're faced with people in your face screaming, and the reaction to, I think there's one video of someone opening the door. Does that then rise to a conspiracy theory that they were involved in? No, the facts did not show that. People were trying to survive the day.
Right. Yeah. So we're going to switch gears a little bit. You're probably grateful for that.
We've asked you lots of questions.
And I'm sure a lot of people, I'm sure everybody asked you about this. Yeah. So here we go. You are now in private practice. And after so many years as a prosecutor, so many years in government in general, why did you make the switch?
So it was over 20 years in public service, and I wanted a new challenge. I just wanted to try something new. I think the government service, public service, is incredible, and I had a good run. After the committee, particularly because it was very intense, I just wanted to do something that was different and have a little bit less emotional connection to my work. I think was welcomed, and that was from a prosecutor as well. There, you know, you can't leave that at your desk when you're prosecuting cases as well. So it was not, it was something I wanted to have some sort of distance to the substance of the work, and you know that was what I was looking forward to, and just having a different challenge. I've worked with some incredibly talented former, you know, big law people, whether it was on the committee or at the U.S. Attorney's Office, and they approach things with a completely different skill set than I had. There's a level of attention to detail. There's just that, you know, when you grow up at a DA's office, you don't have that. The level of writing is completely different when you're trained at a law firm. So it's something that, you know, at this age, I just wanted to do something new, and representing people is a completely different part of what being a lawyer means. It's something that I had never done before.
So part of the reason that we started this podcast is because we want to feature women, we want to speak to young women, but we also want to market women, right? Because there's nothing out there that markets us. So tell us, what is it that you're doing now, and what kind of work are you doing so that everyone out there can hear you, you know, knows about it, can hear about it, can refer you cases?
That's great. So I came to Wilkie with my chief investigative counsel, and we are building out the investigation enforcement practice here at the firm in DC. There was a great platform here already, and we're building it out to bring up the experience of being former prosecutors, but as well as having this congressional experience. So for as far as congressional investigations, as far as for companies' internal investigations, obviously with the DOJ experience, it's white collar representation as well. So it's a you know, kind of investigations writ large, but also just being able to apply this experience that I've had of being 20 years in the government and knowing how to speak to government attorneys, knowing how to navigate DOJ investigations as well as congressional investigations, and being advocates for individuals as well as for companies.
What's the greatest hurdle so far for you in private practice? Because, you know, having, and aside from billables, what's the hardest thing that, you know, you have found on this side? What are you like kind of struggling with?
You know, it's when you're a prosecutor, you know how to gauge success. You know, you have a case, you know the steps to take to investigate it, to indict it, to not indict it, to try it, to dismiss it, whatever. There's a path. And I think here it's you're figuring out what that path is for success, particularly as I'm brought on, and you know, building business, and you know, networking, and it's being entrepreneurial, and it's a lot of these skills that while you're not asked to use when you're in the government. So that's kind of been an interesting, and I won't say it's a challenge. It's just a different aspect of what being a lawyer is. You know, in terms of like marketing, you don't have to market yourself when you're a government attorney, right? You don't have to think about your brand and what you stand for. You stand for doing the right thing,
and the work just comes. The work just
comes. Yes. But here it's different, and it's been fun navigating that new world.
Can you share with us anything that has been effective in your marketing efforts?
I think that it's been great to go to conferences, to be on like panels has been really interesting, and just meeting people, meeting women who are in the same situation and speaking to them about their experience. That's been helpful to me, as well as just knowing that kind of everybody goes through this transition, right? From going from the government to private law firms, whether it's a big law firm or a boutique law firm or starting your own. It's that transition is common to everyone.
So I want to ask you a question about being your authentic self in the workplace. Part of our, you know, running theme on this podcast is, you know, women should be their authentic selves. And at some point in your career, I think, and your age, frankly, if we're going to be candid, you feel like, okay, I just, this is who I am. And we would like younger women lawyers, minority lawyers, females to feel comfortable on day one. It's sometimes hard to be your authentic self in a very male dominated industry, a white male dominated industry, and law firms are the statistics are what they are, more than the government. For you, how do you manage to be your authentic self in the workplace? Is that something you struggle with? Is that something you deal with? What would you say about how you get through that and just say, this is who I am, and take it or leave it?
Yeah, so I was just on a panel about this, like a code switching panel. And I think that what I have found is that while some people start out kind of being someone who they're not when they're early lawyers right out of law school, I fortunately didn't have that experience at the DA's office in Manhattan. It was pretty diverse in 2001, and it was a different era. It was a different time. And because you're not in a culture of, you're really just getting through the day, it's a lot of triage. So you don't even know how to put on somebody else because you're only learning yourself, right? You're 24, 25 years old and you're in court all the time. And in Manhattan, like if you're trying a case and you're trying to be someone you're not, the jury's going to pick up on that. And I think that's how I was developed. So those critical years, those 8 years of my first years out of law school, I think I didn't ever have to think about not being me. I was developing, I was young, I was learning my courtroom, kind of demeanor and who I wanted to be. And then the U.S. Attorney's Office is a little bit different from a DA's office. It's much more posh. And, then I was around people who were, we were at a different age group then, right? Like early 30s, you feel like you know some things. And then you have people who come from law firms who are trained very differently, and they might have a different background, a different pedigree. So then I started thinking, okay, I have to act a certain way. Then 10 years later, now as a partner in a law firm, and you're right, Vanessa, it's like every law firm interview, I was like, and I was surprised. I was surprised at, the white male dominance of the interview process. So then I was like, oh, now should I be acting differently? Should I be saying things differently? So it's weird to me to have started out being not cognizant of it at all. And now at 47 being like, oh, yeah, I'm like the only woman in this room or the only woman of color in this room, which just certainly has happened before. But I think in a law firm atmosphere, it's very different than a law enforcement or public service atmosphere.
It is very different. It is very different. And the setting, I guess, it's the setting, right? I mean, it's just the environment in which you operate. How are you dealing with that at a firm? And it's not specific to Wilkie. This is just the statistics on which corporate America currently exists, right? And so it is harder to, I think, be your authentic self. Having been in the government myself, I could tell you, right? And having done that, I like the phrase code switching, having to code switch. But how are you dealing with that now that you're doing it and going through it? So
I think the benefit of those first 8 years out of law school is that I'm kind of wired to be who I am. And I don't know, while I might, pause and think, oh, I should, think this through more, I am who I am at this point. And I can't switch it up. So if I speak a little bit more practically, or I'm a little bit less, I don't have a lot of corporate speak in me.
It's not a bad thing. Don't worry.
It's not a bad thing at all. I don't use the phrase circle back. I like things that like, I think, I probably would have been trained better on. I just don't do. So I think a lot of the plain speak is still in me, and I can't stop that now. It's how I've been for over 20 years as a lawyer. And I will say, yes, there's, we just had a law firm retreat yesterday, and it's great to see kind of the changing partnership in this law firm I can speak of, the only one I know of having more women, having people of color. It makes it much more, empowering to be yourself. So if I had sat around that same table yesterday and only saw white males, I would still be that 25-year-old girl thinking, oh no, now I've got to switch it up. But seeing people that look like you makes a difference.
Yes, it does.
We've talked a lot about you and your professional career. Can you tell us, where your parents are from? Where'd you grow up?
Sure, yeah. This is better than the January 6th stuff.
Fun stuff. Like, who are you? Like, what's your upbringing? Who are you?
I grew up in central Pennsylvania. My parents were professors. I grew up in a very small college town, and my father was an English literature professor. My mom taught sociology, and very much an immigrant story of being Indian Amish, the only Indian folks of like maybe 8 other families in central Pennsylvania in farmland. So after that, I went to Penn State for undergrad, and then went to Temple University in Philadelphia for law school, which is where my father got his doctorate. So I was happy to go to Temple and follow in his footsteps there. And then after Temple, I went straight to the DA's office in Manhattan and was in New York for about 20 years.
Excellent. I've never heard of that. Indian Amish. See, I learned something
It's a
new
phrase
today.
my sister came up with. It's a good one. It's like, why else? How do Indian people end up in central Pennsylvania? It's academia or farming. So it's academia.
That's right, because usually you go where your people are, right? So I mean,
Right. Exactly.
who would you say your role model is?
Oh man. This should be one that I was prepared to answer, right? So I think about all the different women in my family who I've seen and been able to be resilient to, just the challenges. My mom moved from Bangalore, India, which is a very vibrant city in South India, to a very small town in Pennsylvania, and was very highly educated, but didn't work for the first probably 10 years of our lives, and then became an associate professor at Penn State after getting her doctorate. So I think that just seeing the steps she took to kind of nurture herself, even though she had a supportive husband, she had kids, there was always something more she wanted to pursue. That really, looking back, served as kind of an example of how to kind of pursue these like life career moves. That's okay to not be satisfied with just being married and having kids, to be able to want something more and be fulfilled with your career.
Well, kudos to her, because that's not hard. That's not easy in that time. When she grew
Right.
up.
I just want to say I was very impressed. I was going to say I was very impressed by that story.
Yeah.
What do you do to relax?
So having young kids, as I'm sure you guys just like, I want to give that answer that spending time with my kids is relaxing, but it's
not true.
Girl, I hide in the bathroom. People ask me all the time. People are like, "What do you do?" And I'm like, "I hide in the bathroom. I try to get away from them."
It's nice sometimes when they're on best behavior to hang out with them. I also wish I could say like I go for a run. I don't do that. I like literally watch TV on my couch to relax. I've now thankfully started to read again. There was a moment like for years where I wasn't even able to read fiction. All I could get through was like a New Yorker article. So I think reading has provided a great escape for me again that I had forgotten about. So reading fiction and just getting involved in characters and wanting to go back to a book that you have a bookmark in, I think that's like a joy that I forgot about, that I'm happy to have some time to be able to do that now.
What are you reading right now?
I'm reading this book called Seven Moons. It's by this Sri Lankan author. It won the Booker or the Pulitzer last year, but it's hard to explain. A wartime photographer who's basically trying to come back from being dead. It's fascinating. Wow. Yeah.
So I read it. It's really good.
Oh, you
did?
See, we need to start an Athena Rising book club. Look at us. If you weren't a lawyer, what would you be doing?
So, there was a time when I wanted to be an actress like 25 years ago, and my parents were like, no, that's never going to happen.
You could have been Priyanka. Look at you.
I could have been Priyanka, yeah. And then I thought like being a trial attorney replaced that because it is some form of performance.
It is.
But I think that I'm really, really impressed with journalists that are out there now that are really trying to get to the truth of stories and tell, not just political stories, but storytelling generally from a journalistic perspective is something that I've always been fascinated with. So I feel like if I weren't an attorney, I would, and I could turn back time, I'd go to like journalism school and pursue that.
Do you have any summer travel plans?
Not for the summer, but we're going to Italy in the fall for
Nice.
my husband's aunt's birthday, which will be lovely.
Nice.
Nice.
Where in Italy?
Tuscany.
Oh, wow.
So nice.
Beautiful area.
Is this the rapid question part, by the way?
Yes. Yes.
Okay.
Okay. What's your greatest strength?
I once got the Grace Under Pressure Award at the DA's office from my chief, which now seems ages ago, but I think that's something that I've been able to maintain is kind of have a slow heartbeat towards crisis. And that's definitely not always, but I try to at least have some sort of picture of calm.
What is the best advice you've ever received?
It's so different in different aspects, right? I think that the best advice that I have gotten is from my sister, who said, "What is yours will not pass you by." And she probably stole it from somebody, but I think that that's true, whether it's, finding a partner or having kids or finding your job. Like, what's meant to be is meant to be. And I think that when I look at my career and look at these different pivots I've taken, and now where I am now, this is where I'm supposed to be right now, and I'm going to enjoy it and lean into it and hopefully succeed at it. And then you just have living in the moment and knowing that that's what the moment is designed for you to be is really important.
If you could look at yourself 10 years from now, what would that picture look like?
10 years from now?
Yes.
Oh man. So I think one of the things that I've recently learned is that these legal careers are long. Like, you think at age 35, oh, I'm like 10 years out of law school, I know it all, and now 20 years out. Like, I really see myself, closer 10 years from now, 57. I mean, I hope to really be successful at this job, at being a partner in a law firm and everything that means, right? Whether that's building a business, whether that's, being able to see more partners around a table that look like me, to be able to bring other women up. I think that success can be in different ways, but I hope to be able to, not just have like recognition within my peer group, but feel good about what I'm doing.
We always end with this. Is there one piece of advice that you'd like to share with the young women listening?
For young women, I think the best thing is to find your mentors. And I know people often say that, but having kind of grown up where I didn't have formal mentorship, and I think that's something that law firms do very well, is matching up partners with associates and kind of forcing some sort of mentorship to happen. Yes. I think the best advice I can give is it doesn't have to be a formal mentorship. If you connect with somebody who's 5 years or 10 years or 15 years older than you, pursue that friendship. Like, don't even view it as a mentorship. Just be able to have something in common with that person that you want to go to for advice, and have advice that you trust, because I think that's hard. And all of us who've had good mentorships, it's because we identify with that person, something in their background you connect with. And that's something that only you know what that is. It could be that person's also a fan of like the Philadelphia Eagles. Like, if that's your basis, that's your basis. It doesn't matter what it is. It's just that you trust that person and that you actually enjoy and like that person. So I think sometimes mentorships that are formed naturally are better.
That's great advice. Well, Soumya, this has been great. Thank you for doing it. We could ask you a lot more questions, a lot more rapid fire questions, but we spent our time on January 6th. Who would have thought? I will say this, don't code switch. You're awesome the way that you are. Don't make a law firm make you feel like you need to have a different voice. There's a reason you're there and that you got there, and it's because you're you and you're your authentic self. So I wish you the best of luck in private practice. If we could ever help you, reach out to us. Please do. It's been awesome to get to know you. and to meet you.
Thank you. I really appreciate it. And this is a great podcast. I hope that continued success and seeking out awesome women to feature as well. I appreciate the time you've given me.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.